I knew no matter what else would happen today, when I saw Keen Berger's name for handling the coffee hour, that everything was going to be awesome, because no matter what else, you were going to have her cookies to eat, and all would be well. I have been known to preach. Not from a pulpit, mind you, but ask someone who sings in one of my choirs and they might tell you that I can get a little preachy sometimes. If I'm being honest, I do occasionally have a tendency to climb into the pulpit and sermonize if I have a bee in my bonnet about something or other. My partner David might tell you that he's heard a few sermons outside of church. But the idea of standing here in front of you and imparting some kind of wisdom in the form of an actual sermon has had me a little bit terrified. And I've heard a lot of sermons in my life. I have sat through sermons that brought tears to my eyes, sermons that made me angry or frustrated or confused, and more often than I'd like to admit, sermons that just put me to sleep. Never here, of course. On one memorable occasion, I fell asleep at the organ during a sermon. I had decided to remain at school one summer during college, and I had to find a summer job. And unfortunately, the only job I could find was flipping hamburgers at a Hardee's. A Hardee's is like a McDonald's in the South. So I found the job at Hardee's, and it was the overnight shift. So on a Sunday morning, I would leave the Hardee's after working all night, and I would have to drive straight to my church job at a small country UCC congregation up the road, just outside of Broadway, Virginia. I find it kind of funny that my first church job was off Broadway, too. You saw that one coming. Well, showing up to choir practice after fry cooking all night and then having to do a service is not a recipe for success, and sure enough, one Sunday morning, I fell asleep at the organ during the sermon, crash right onto the keyboard, letting out an unholy cacophony that woke me up. And maybe anyone else who was asleep too, so it may not have been a total loss. Growing up Southern Baptist, I spent an awful lot of time in church, and for 24 years now, I've been a church musician, going all the way back to that first job at Bethlehem United Church of Christ. I've worked for Jesuit Catholics, Franciscan Catholics, other Catholics, Episcopals, Lutherans, non-denominational Who's-He-What's-It's, Congregationalists, Church of the Brethrens, and probably some I can't remember. So when I say I've heard a lot of sermons, it ain't no joke. So what about giving a sermon should trouble me? I guess part of the problem is, if you ask me what I believe, I have a hard time telling you. I believe in right and wrong, duh. I believe in justice and injustice. I do not believe that all people were created equal because, let's face it, as a white male born to comfortably middle-class parents in the United States of America, I have a decided advantage over a significant portion of the world's population. But then again, I do believe that what we all too often define for ourselves as success, as attainment, as well-being, or living the good life is decidedly askew from what any of those things actually mean. How often do we have to remind ourselves that money does not equal happiness, that a promotion or an accolade from our peers does not correspond to success, or that a new sofa or a new iPad or a new car does not bring with it contentment or healing, or that deep, all-encompassing kind of peace of the spirit, for which so many of those things are all too often just poor substitutes. Now, mind you, a new pair of shoes will always do wonders for my soul, but that's a whole nother sermon. So many things in life are cyclical. We take from our parents and our grandparents and our friends and our teachers a whole host of knowledge and learned behavior and ideas about morality and social norms, and they get mixed together in our own personal, mental, sort of spiritual Cuisinart. And what comes out, the substance of our lives, is like a smoothie. And my smoothie is not your smoothie. We are all unique. But I suspect that when we sit down together and compare notes, we find that the ingredients in our smoothies, those secret ingredients, are a lot more similar than they are different. Because we've all used the ingredients that were passed down to us by our families and friends and mentors and our faith traditions. And sometimes you realize the ingredients you're using, you may not actually really like. Like, sorry, I got lost. You don't really like, oh, and if you had a choice, you'd say, no, thanks. I don't want high fructose corn syrup in my smoothie. But like an order that gets screwed up in the drive-thru, once you've driven away, you can't go back and fix it. You could, but it's a pain in the butt, and most of us don't take the time to do it. So, it's also kind of like saying you'd like to go back in the uterus and order from a different menu. You just can't do it. Hey, you forgot to give me the athletic gene, or the one for math, or the one that would help me figure out why I'm always late. I have many wonderful memories of my grandmother, Edna Mae Schnur. She was a whip-smart, funny, kind woman who taught school on Indian reservations out west, and in her later years ran a successful gift emporium with her two sisters in a tiny mining town high in the mountains of Colorado. She was the best boggle player who ever lived. She was also a card shark who loved professional wrestling, so people are complicated. But she could also be very, very critical. I remember one occasion when my mother passed me the phone saying that Grandma was on the line and wanted to say hi, and so I said, "Hi, Grandma," and after a few pleasantries, she began berating me for my poor handwriting in my most recent post-Christmas thank you card. I'm not really sure if the reason I remember that long ago conversation with my grandmother says more about her being critical or me being a hypersensitive child who didn't like being criticized. What I do know is that my grandmother's tendency to be a little on the critical side became my mother's tendency to be a little on the critical side. And well, it probably became my tendency as well. It's part of my smoothie, whether I like that particular ingredient or not. And while I love my parents more than I can say, I know for certain that I could write 20 sermons detailing all the ways they've made me a better person. It is still the case that with the good comes the bad. And my mom's critical ways are an ingredient that I carry with me, for better or worse. I remember as a kid sitting at the piano, practicing away, and from the other side of the house, all the way from the kitchen, would sound forth my mother's voice. "Well, that didn't sound so good." Or, "Are you just going to keep practicing wrong notes all day?" Uh-huh. Why am I harping on this one little ingredient that constitutes just a small part of my own personal life recipe? Because in a way, it's right at the center of everything that has ended up being good and bad about me. And I bet I'm not alone. It's that little voice that interrupts at the most inopportune times, that nasty little devil that rides on our shoulder and whispers insistently, "Are you gonna keep practicing wrong notes?" That mockingbird refrain. It really has nothing to do with mom or grandma or anyone else who might be convenient to blame. It's mine, all mine, and it's yours. It's the voice of self-doubt, of not trusting yourself, of not loving yourself the way God intended for you and for me to be loved. As one of my heroes, RuPaul, put it so sickeningly, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anybody else? Can I get an amen? Exactly. As we have entered into the season of Lent, Don and Michael have both talked a lot about forgiveness as a spiritual practice, and we are challenging one another here to, rather than give something up during Lent, to take on a different spiritual practice and see how incorporating it into our Lenten journey can hopefully be a healing and renewing experience. And I'm going to continue that theme, but I want to focus this week and take on, as much as our hypercritical little self-psyches will allow, the practice of forgiving ourselves. You see, it all comes back to that Hardee's, the ridiculous fast food restaurant where I flipped burgers for one long hot summer. Back then, a junior in college, I literally had my whole life in front of me. I knew I wanted to be a conductor and a composer, and I also knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that after college, I was going to take the musical and theatrical world by storm and become the next Leonard Bernstein, but actually better than Bernstein because I was also going to possess Stephen Sondheim's incomparable gift for witty and erudite lyrics. And why not? This was, in my heart of hearts, what I believed was possible, nay, inevitable. And while I toiled away at that Hardee's, I met some pretty extraordinary characters. The biscuit maker named Malon, who would shuffle in around 3 a.m. and set himself up making the biscuits in a cloud of flour dust, all the while muttering under his breath about things that happened to him in Vietnam and about how the burgers at Hardee's sucked because they didn't use paprika, and that paprika was the spice of life, don't you know? And then there was my fellow fry cook, a 17-year-old recently out of prison who had gotten his girlfriend pregnant and thrown out of his parents' house and was generally just making a mess of his life. And man, could he talk. All night long he could talk. But he had big dreams too. And the more I got to know these people, these quirky, awesome people, it got me to thinking about writing a musical. I mean, my God, they were characters who'd already written their own lines. And there were others from that time, like my voice teacher, who, when I entered her office for the very first time, just sat quietly behind her desk, staring at me. And after a long time, she whispered in a sort of mystical voice, "Purple. You are a purple person." She became a character too. My musical began to take shape, and all I had to do was translate these awesome people into dialogue and songs, and well, the whole thing was just going to write itself, and it was destined to be a mega hit. How could it not? But here's where my smoothie gets in the way. That darn high-fructose, overly critical smoothie rears its ugly head. As it happens, I finished school, got my degree, and I also got a fiance of the female variety, and we decided getting married was a great idea at the age of 23. And simultaneously, I started grad school at Westminster Choir College. Then we moved to New York, and of course I had to work, and through my Westminster connections, I got a job at a gigantic Catholic church on the Upper East Side, St. Ignatius Loyola, and that job just swallowed me whole for the next 4 years. And somewhere in there, with all those masses and weddings and funerals and concerts and trying to make ends meet and figure out how to survive in the big bad city, somewhere in there, something did in fact happen. Oh yes, somewhere in there, this is the good stuff. I also got divorced, realized I was gay, came out, met a nice guy, lived with him for several years, got a different job at another Catholic church, survived 9/11, survived a year in Rhode Island, survived 5 years in Staten Island, survived moving 12 times in 14 years, and as Sondheim would say, I'm still here. I survived. And I always had work, I always had food, I always had a loving family, I had dear friends, I had opportunities, so many opportunities to grow as an artist, as a person, as a man. And I don't regret any of that, not for a second. It's all part of me now. It's part of my smoothie. And to me, it's delicious. I can say that now, but I haven't always. You see, somewhere along the way, with all that living that I was busy doing, I forgot about Hardee's. I forgot about Malon, the biscuit maker, and my fellow fry cooks and cashiers. I forgot who I was going to be. I forgot about my musical. And the longer I forgot, the harder it became to forgive myself for not following the path I thought I should have, for getting distracted, for living the life that I was handed instead of the life that I dreamed for myself. To be sure, it was never totally forgotten. I had a folder full of everything I'd ever written and scribbled down about that musical, and I'd walk by its lonely place on the bookshelf, and a little voice would call to me, "Hey, you, yeah, you, remember me? Your life's work, your heart's desire, your fondest dreams, yeah, I'm talking to you." And most of the time, I'd walk right on by that obnoxious little prick. But every once in a while, I'd pull that beat-up old folder full of fragments of dialogue and songs off the shelf, and I would spend a little time with it. And I'd think about it wistfully, my musical. Not, as it turned out, my first musical, or just that silly thing I was writing when I was in college. Isn't that charming now that I'm the toast of Broadway and all? Oh, right, because this is all there is. This old, beat-up folder full of broken promises and forgotten dreams. And so I'd put it back on the shelf, where it would sit, along with anything else I couldn't figure out how to forgive myself for. Because I didn't somehow follow the timeline that I'd set for myself. because I didn't come to New York and win a Tony and buy a house in the Hamptons and find myself on People magazine's list of the 50 sexiest men alive. Yeah, because of all that, I couldn't forgive myself. And the longer I let that musical sit on the shelf, the harder it became to imagine ever picking it up again, to even see a glimpse of the possibility of any kind of forgiveness. Life did not get in the way of writing that musical. I did. My own fears and doubts and second guessings and misplaced priorities and everything else I had on the plate for the last 20 years. I mean, for crying out loud, this city is hard. It ain't no walk in the park. And the path I was so sure I was going to follow was a fantasy. And that's okay. I needed that fantasy, and I still do. It's part of my smoothie, too. But somewhere along the way, I had to learn to forgive myself for not being the person I thought I would be when I was just a babe in the woods. I have to forgive myself for not following a road that I could never have followed for one simple reason. It didn't exist. It was never mine, and it never could have been. I've heard a lot of talk about the weather this year. I have talked a lot about the weather this year. Some of you may know that I truly, deeply, madly, passionately love snow. I actually like winter. I like sweaters and boots and warm woolen mittens, and these are a few of my favorite things. But even I have to say, enough already. It might even snow tomorrow, for crying out loud. Some of the talk I've heard has been about the winter blues, how the shorter days and the long nights and the endless gray, how it has a very real and sometimes debilitating effect on us, leading to depression and anxiety and just wanting to cocoon and sleep in your house for a week. But without discounting the very real effect that seasons have on us, because they do, I want to propose the following: that winter, like forgiveness, is all just a state of mind. That even as we endure bitterly cold days and ice-covered sidewalks, all of that is just an illusion. Nothing around us has really changed. Nothing we hope to accomplish on a given day is any less palpable or ready to burst into bloom. Nothing is any less attainable just because it happens to be cold outside. No desire is so buried beneath the snows of our regrets or our fears or our inability to say to ourselves 3 little words: I forgive you, that they wouldn't just come charging up out of the ground and burst into living, vibrant flowers right before our eyes, like the crocuses and the daffodils at just the merest hint of the sun's warmth. 3 little words: I forgive you. There are crocuses and daffodils right now in my yard, already coming up, even after the snow and ice of this long, dreary winter have done their damnedest to say, oh, no, you don't. They're saying, oh, yes, we do. We were here all along. We just needed a little sun. We forgive you. You see, while winter may seem like the enemy right now, even that is an illusion. The cycle of flowering and dying and lying dormant, and after a time, rebirth, is as fundamental to how we live our lives as the cycle of an ordinary day: waking, eating, working, and sleeping. To everything, there is a season. All those years I kept saying no to finishing that stupid musical were a kind of winter. My dormant, fallow seeds of creativity and joy were just waiting for a little sun. They were waiting for me to say, I forgive you. I forgive me. One day, a few years ago, something clicked. It just snapped, and I'd had enough. I was on winter break, ironically, from teaching and had a couple weeks to myself. And I basically chained myself to the computer, and I sat down, and in the span of less than 2 weeks, I did what I had failed to do for the previous 20 years. I wrote the libretto from start to finish. Truth be told, and as Rethel or Tom or Lulu or John Cormier or Suzanne or Ken Kidd or John Onderdonk or anyone else who was misfortunate enough to be at the first reading could tell you, I wrote way too much libretto. I basically wrote War and Peace, the musical, but I wrote it. And shortly thereafter, over the course of the next year, I finished all the songs, and then I edited it, and I rewrote, and I scrapped, and I added, and I tinkered some more. And then a dear friend of mine introduced me to someone who she thought I'd hit it off with creatively, and she was right. And he took on the Herculean task of turning my humongous tome into something resembling a real workable libretto, and he's doing an amazing job. But after all of that, I came to realize something important, something fundamental. I couldn't have written that musical in 1991. I couldn't even have written it 10 years later, because every day of my life, every experience, every chance meeting, every failed relationship, every realization about myself and life, even everything I'd learned as a musician and a composer, everything that has ended up defining who I've become has made its way into that little show. The journey of my musical is the story of my own journey, and while it may never end up on Broadway, and it may not end up earning me a Tony, and I'm fairly certain it won't buy me a house in the Hamptons, it is, in a very palpable way, the most precious thing I will ever create. Like the crocuses in our yard, after this long, brutal winter, with just a little sunshine, have already said, "I'm here. I was always here." Didn't you notice? It's the same for us. Like the sun, like warmth, like spring itself. It's what we get when we say those words. The winter and the weather be damned. 3 little words, I forgive you. As the psalmist says, as far as the east is from the west, so far hath God removed our transgressions from us. If God can forgive me, then surely I can forgive myself. And so can you. I don't know if I gave you a single word of wisdom today, because like I said in the beginning, I'm not always too sure what I believe. But like the Chinese proverb, I know this. A bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. Amen.